Dr. Michael Carter stood before the reinforced door of SCP-032's containment chamber, his hand lingering over the access panel. His heart pounded in his chest, a cold sweat clinging to the back of his neck. He had faced countless anomalies during his tenure with the SCP Foundation, but something about SCP-032 had set him on edge since he first read its file. The entity known as the Brother's Bride had an aura of malevolence that clung to it like a shroud, an uneasy feeling that made his skin crawl. The dimly lit corridor outside the chamber was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the facility's air filtration system. Dr. Carter took a deep breath, steeling himself before he punched in the code and the door hissed open. He stepped inside, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to thicken, as if the very air resisted his presence. SCP-032 sat at the center of the room, perched on a simple metal chair. Its form was humanoid, unnervingly still, and almost lifelike, but not quite. Pale skin, devoid of any warmth, stretched taut over delicate bones. Its eyes were closed, but even in this dormant state, there was an unsettling sense of awareness emanating from it, as though it was watching him even without sight. The entity wore a plain white gown, the fabric falling loosely around its frame, adding to the illusion of a ghostly bride waiting for an unseen groom. Dr. Carter, reporting for initial interaction with SCP-032, he spoke into the recorder clipped to his lab coat, his voice a strained attempt at professionalism. Commencing interview at 1,300 hours. He approached the entity cautiously, each footstep echoing in the small chamber. SCP-032 remained motionless, a porcelain doll abandoned on display. Dr. Carter cleared his throat, his voice wavering slightly as he addressed it. SCP-032, can you hear me? A silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. For a moment, Dr. Carter thought it might not respond at all. Then, slowly, SCP-032's eyes opened. He felt a jolt of unease. The eyes were hollow, devoid of any color or light, like two black voids staring straight into his soul. I hear you, Dr. Carter, it said, its voice a whisper that seemed to echo from the depths of an abyss. I hear you as I hear all things in this place. Dr. Carter suppressed a shudder. The entity's voice was cold and detached, each word carefully measured. Can you tell me about yourself? Your origins, he asked, keeping his tone steady. SCP-032 tilted its head slightly, a gesture that was almost curious, if not for the inhuman stillness of its body. I am as I was made, it replied, born from the union of thought and void, a bride fashioned for a purpose not my own. I am a reflection, a shadow cast by the light of forgotten gods. The words sent a chill down Dr. Carter's spine. There was something deeply unsettling about the way SCP-032 spoke, as if it knew more than it was letting on, as if it held secrets that could shatter the sanity of those who sought them. What do you mean by a reflection? Dr. Carter pressed, his curiosity piqued despite the creeping dread. A reflection of what? SCP-032's lips curved into a faint, almost mocking smile. A reflection of those who gaze upon me. I mirror what lies within, the darkness they hide even from themselves. You see, Dr. Carter, I am but a vessel, a bride with no groom, a story with no end. He felt a surge of unease. The Foundation's files had hinted at SCP-032's ability to mimic emotions, but this was something different. It spoke in riddles, its words hinting at a deeper truth, one that Dr. Carter was not sure he wanted to uncover. Why are you here, then? He asked, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. What is your purpose? SCP-032's expression softened, a semblance of pity crossing its otherwise impassive face. Purpose? There is no purpose, only existence. I am here because I am meant to be here, just as you are meant to stand before me, seeking answers that will only lead to more questions. Dr. Carter's throat tightened. The entity's words resonated with an unsettling truth, one that spoke to the very nature of the Foundation and its ceaseless quest for understanding. He glanced at his notes, searching for a new line of questioning, but the words blurred on the page. SCP-032, he began again, struggling to regain control of the conversation. The Foundation believes you may be connected to other anomalies. Can you tell us anything about this? Are you aware of others like you? The entity's gaze bore into him, those empty eyes seeming to peer into the depths of his mind. I am aware, it said slowly, of many things. Others like me, yet not like me. We are threads woven into the same tapestry, bound by fate and circumstance. But knowledge, Dr. Carter, is not a gift freely given. It is a burden, one that you must choose to bear. Dr. Carter felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had read countless reports on anomalies with strange and horrific abilities, but SCP-032 was different. It was not just an anomaly, it was a presence, an entity that seemed to understand the Foundation, to see through its sterile procedures and clinical detachment. I will uncover the truth, he found himself saying, more to himself than to the entity. Whatever it takes, I will find out what you are. SCP-032's smile widened, a haunting expression that made his skin crawl. The truth, Dr. Carter, it whispered, is a bride's veil, delicate and easily torn. Be careful what you seek, for behind the veil lies not light, but darkness. The room seemed to darken around him, the shadows closing in as SCP-032's words echoed in his mind. He took a step back, suddenly desperate to put distance between himself and the entity. The door behind him slid open with a hiss, and he stumbled into the hallway, the light blinding after the oppressive gloom of the chamber. As the door closed behind him, Dr. Carter stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He had faced SCP-032, and he had come away with more questions than answers. A bride with no groom, a reflection of darkness. What did it all mean? And what secrets did SCP-032 hold within its hollow gaze? One thing was certain, this was only the beginning. Dr. Carter sat at his desk, the glow of the computer screen casting eerie shadows across his face. The sterile walls of his office seemed to close in on him, and the hum of the overhead lights had taken on an unsettling quality, a low drone that resonated in his bones. He scrolled through the sparse documentation on SCP-032, hoping to find a thread to pull, something that would unravel the enigma he had faced just hours before. The encounter with SCP-032 had left him rattled. Its words lingered in his mind, echoing in the silence like a haunting refrain. A bride with no groom, a reflection of darkness. What did it mean? What was SCP-032 truly? The initial file on SCP-032 was frustratingly vague, offering little beyond the basics humanoid in appearance, potentially sentient, capable of mimicking the emotions and fears of those around it. But its origins, there was almost nothing. It was as if SCP-032 had simply appeared one day, a mystery wrapped in layers of ambiguity. Dr. Carter opened a series of encrypted files, using his clearance to access reports from other researchers. He combed through records of interactions, tests, and containment procedures, searching for any hint of where SCP-032 might have come from. Most of it was standard protocol interviews, containment logs, psych evaluations of personnel who had interacted with it. Yet, in every line, he sensed a shadow of something deeper, a darkness that the words themselves could not capture. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. There had to be more. Something they had missed, something hidden in the labyrinth of SCP-032's cryptic nature. He glanced at a stack of physical files on his desk, documents that had been deemed too sensitive for digital storage. Perhaps the answer lay in the older records, in the handwritten notes and yellowed pages. Dr. Carter reached for the topmost file, its cover marked with a faint layer of dust. As he flipped it open, a cold draft seemed to sweep through the room, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. The first page was a handwritten report from a previous researcher, Dr. Hendricks, who had interacted with SCP-032 shortly after its initial containment. There is something inherently wrong about SCP-032, Dr. Hendricks had written. It speaks in riddles, yet those riddles feel like truths waiting to be uncovered. It claims to be a bride, but what it is truly married to remains a mystery. I have experienced dreams since our last encounter, visions of dark rituals, of beings older than time itself. I fear there is more to SCP-032 than meets the eye, a darkness that reaches beyond our understanding. Dr. Carter felt a chill creep up his spine as he read. Dr. Hendricks' observations echoed his own feelings. There was a sense of dread woven into every interaction with SCP-032, a foreboding that suggested something ancient and malevolent at play. He turned the page and found a series of sketches, crude, frantic drawings of symbols and sigils that he did not recognize. They were arranged in intricate patterns, spirals and circles that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He stared at them, mesmerized and repulsed in equal measure, as if they were reaching out to him from the page, pulling him into their endless maze. As he studied the sketches, a knock on his door startled him, breaking the spell. He quickly closed the file, clearing his throat. "Come in," he called, trying to steady his voice. The door creaked open, and Dr. Emily Hawkins, a colleague and fellow researcher, stepped inside. She looked concerned, her eyes flicking to the pile of files on his desk. "Michael," she began cautiously, "you look like you've seen a ghost. Are you all right?" Dr. Carter forced a smile. "I'm fine, Emily. Just going through the records on SCP-032, trying to make sense of it." Dr. Hawkins nodded, but her expression remained skeptical. SCP-032 has that effect on people. It gets under your skin. I read through some of Dr. Hendricks' notes a while back, disturbing stuff. Did you know he had nightmares for weeks after his last interview with it? Dr. Carter nodded slowly. "I just read about that. Do you know if there were any other unusual incidents associated with SCP-032? Anything that might give us a clue about its origin?" Dr. Hawkins hesitated, glancing around the room as if the walls themselves might be listening. "There were rumors," she said in a hushed tone. "Unconfirmed, of course. But some believe SCP-032 is linked to something older, some kind of cult or ancient ritual. The Foundation has tried to trace its origins, but every lead ends in dead ends or more questions." Dr. Carter's pulse quickened. Cult. Rituals. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did they find anything concrete?" Dr. Hawkins shook her head. "Nothing we can use. Just fragments, stories of brides offered to gods, of mirrors that reflect more than just your image. It's like SCP-032 is part of a myth that predates us, something that was never meant to be understood." A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken fears. Dr. Carter could feel the weight of SCP-032 pressing in on him, a dark presence that loomed just beyond the edge of comprehension. "I need to know more," he said finally, his voice trembling with resolve. "I need to understand what we're dealing with." Dr. Hawkins gave him a long, searching look. "Just be careful, Michael. SCP-032 isn't just another anomaly. It changes people. It makes them see things they can't unsee." He nodded, knowing her warning was more than just professional concern. There was genuine fear in her eyes, a fear that mirrored his own. As she left, closing the door softly behind her, Dr. Carter returned to the file, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages. At the very back of the file, tucked between two pages, he found an old photograph. It was faded, almost unrecognizable, but he could make out the shape of a woman standing in a field, her face turned away from the camera. She wore a white gown, eerily similar to the one SCP-032 wore in its containment chamber. His breath caught in his throat. Was this SCP-032 before it was contained? Or was it someone or something else entirely? The edges of the photograph were frayed, as if it had been handled countless times. Scribbled on the back in faint pencil were the words "The Bride of Shadows." Dr. Carter stared at the photograph, a sense of dread washing over him. The Bride of Shadows, what did it mean? Was it a name, a title, or a warning? He felt as if he were standing on the precipice of a dark abyss, staring into the void that SCP-032 claimed to know so well. He placed the photograph back into the file, his hands clammy with sweat. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. He knew now that this was not just another SCP to be contained and studied. SCP-032 was a mystery that defied the Foundation's protocols, a darkness that whispered of ancient secrets and forgotten horrors. Dr. Carter leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the closed door of his office. Somewhere, in the depths of the facility, SCP-032 waited, a bride with no groom, a reflection of darkness. And he had the chilling realization that perhaps, just perhaps, it was watching him even now. Dr. Carter walked through the dimly lit corridors of the Foundation, his mind swirling with the implications of what he had uncovered. The image of the woman in the photograph, the Bride of Shadows, haunted him. Who was she? And what connection did she have with SCP-032? Each step echoed in the oppressive silence, a reminder of the isolation he felt within the cold, sterile confines of the facility. He approached SCP-032's containment chamber, his heart thudding with an uneasy rhythm. Today he was scheduled for another session with the entity, and the sense of dread that hung over him was almost suffocating. As he stood before the door, a fleeting thought crossed his mind. Was it wise to confront it again so soon? To look into those void-like eyes and risk whatever darkness lay within? He pushed the thought aside. He needed answers. The door slid open with a low hiss, revealing SCP-032 seated exactly as before. The entity had not moved since his last visit, its posture eerily still, like a statue forgotten and dark. Its eyes were closed, but Dr. Carter knew that meant nothing. It was always aware, always watching. Dr. Carter, returning to SCP-032 for continued interaction, he spoke into his recorder, trying to keep his voice steady. Commencing session at 1,500 hours. As if on cue, SCP-032's eyes opened. The black void seemed deeper today, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. He felt an almost physical pressure, a sense of being drawn into an abyss with no bottom. "Welcome back, Dr. Carter," SCP-032 said, its voice as cold and hollow as before. "You seek the truth still, I see." "Yes," Dr. Carter replied, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I want to understand you. Your origins, your purpose." SCP-032 smiled faintly, a ghost of an expression that sent a shiver down his spine. "Understanding is a double-edged blade. Are you prepared to bleed for it?" Dr. Carter ignored the question, focusing on his notes. He had to maintain control of the conversation, keep it from slipping into the entity's twisted wordplay. "Tell me about the Bride of Shadows," he said, keeping his tone firm. "Who is she, and what is your connection to her?" The entity's smile widened, and for a moment Dr. Carter saw something flicker in its eyes, a reflection, a glimmer of something that was not there before. His breath hitched as he realized it was his own face staring back at him, twisted and distorted, as if seen through a darkened mirror. "I am the bride," SCP-032 whispered, its voice resonating with a chilling echo. "And I am not. I am the reflection of what you see, Dr. Carter, a mirror that shows you the darkness you carry within." He felt his pulse quicken, the air growing thin around him. The room seemed to shift, the walls bending inward, and for a moment he was no longer in the containment chamber but standing in a vast, empty space. Shadows swirled around him, shapes forming and dissolving at the edge of his vision. He heard whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind from a place far beyond. "You see," SCP-032 continued, its voice echoing in the emptiness. "I am bound to reflect, to show you the face you hide from yourself, the fears you bury deep, the truths you dare not speak." Dr. Carter shook his head, trying to dispel the illusion. This was not real. It was SCP-032's doing, a trick of the mind. He closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing, grounding himself in the reality of the room. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the chamber, the cold, sterile walls pressing in on him. SCP-032 watched him with those hollow eyes, its expression unreadable. "You cannot escape what you are, Dr. Carter. The mirror does not lie. It merely shows you what you refuse to see." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had read about the mirror effect, SCP-032's ability to reflect the emotions and thoughts of those around it. But this was something far more insidious. It wasn't just reflecting, it was projecting, drawing out the shadows within his mind and giving them form. "Why do you do this?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite himself. "What purpose does it serve?" SCP-032 tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a ripple of unease through him. "Purpose is a human concept," it said softly. "I do not act with purpose. I am what I am, a reflection, a shadow cast by the light of your own making." He stared at the entity, his mind racing. It was speaking in riddles again, but there was a truth hidden within its words, a truth that eluded him like a wisp of smoke. He thought of the photograph, of the rituals Dr. Hendricks had hinted at. Was SCP-032 merely a vessel, a conduit for something far darker? "Enough," he said, taking a step back. "This conversation is over." SCP-032 smiled once more, a knowing smile that chilled him to his core. "You cannot end what has already begun, Dr. Carter. The mirror is already in place, and the reflection has already been cast. You will see the truth, whether you wish to or not." He turned and hurried from the room, the door sealing behind him with a final, echoing thud. He stood in the corridor, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows around him seemed to move, shifting and whispering in the corners of his vision. As he made his way back to his office, the sensation of being watched never left him. It was as if the walls themselves had eyes, and SCP-032 was there in every shadow, every darkened corner, reflecting his deepest fears back at him. He locked himself in his office, leaning against the door as he tried to catch his breath. His hands were shaking, and he felt an icy dread settle in his bones. The entity had gotten inside his head, twisted his thoughts, and turned them against him. He moved to his desk, intending to record his observations, to make some sense of what had just happened. But as he sat down, his reflection in the computer screen caught his eye. He froze, staring at the image of himself staring back at him. Except it wasn't him. The eyes in the reflection were not his own. They were hollow, empty voids that seemed to pull at him, drawing him into their endless darkness. He gasped and jerked back, but the reflection remained, smiling that faint, mocking smile that SCP-032 had worn. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's impossible." But deep down, he knew the truth. The mirror had been placed, and now it was showing him what he had refused to see all along. SCP-032 had not just reflected his fears. It had become them, taken root in his mind, and begun to fester. Dr. Carter turned away from the screen, his mind reeling. The entity had warned him, and he had not listened. Now it was too late. The reflection was there, staring back at him from every dark surface, every shadowed corner. It was a part of him now, an inescapable presence that whispered of truths he dared not acknowledge. He was not just studying SCP-032, he was becoming it. And as he sat in the dim silence of his office, he knew that the mirror was only beginning to reveal its horrors. Dr. Carter sat in the dim glow of his office, the shadows around him growing darker with every passing hour. The feeling of being watched hadn't left him since his last encounter with SCP-032. It had slipped into his mind like a virus, poisoning his thoughts, twisting his perception of reality. He found himself glancing into mirrors, screens, and reflective surfaces, dreading what he might see looking back. He knew he couldn't face SCP-032 again. Not yet. But he could still dig into the Foundation's archives, find out what it was hiding about this entity. There had to be more to SCP-032 than what was on the surface. The Foundation was known for its secrets, its layers of buried truths that only those with the right clearance could access. He took a deep breath and turned to his computer, logging into the secure network. His fingers trembled slightly as he navigated to the restricted files, entering his clearance codes with a sense of unease. There were classified sections he had never been privy to, areas of the database that were only accessible to those at the very top. But now, after his encounters with SCP-032, he was granted temporary access. The screen flickered as the system processed his request, lines of code scrolling past before settling on a new folder. It was labeled simply, SCP-032, Confidential Archives. Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment, then clicked on it, bracing himself for what he might find. The folder opened to reveal a series of documents, some marked with the highest level of confidentiality. He clicked on the first file, a document titled Initial Containment Report. As he read through it, his heart sank. The report detailed SCP SCP-032's capture, an event shrouded in mystery and contradictions. SCP-032 had been found in an abandoned church in Eastern Europe, sitting alone in the dark, as if waiting for someone. The locals spoke of a haunted bride that had appeared overnight, whispering dark prophecies to those who dared approach. The Foundation had moved quickly, erasing all evidence and securing the entity before the stories could spread. Dr. Carter scrolled further down the document and found a notation that caught his eye. It mentioned an artifact recovered with SCP-032, a mirror shattered and scattered across the floor of the church. The fragments had been collected and brought back to the Foundation, but their whereabouts were unknown. The mirror effect, he whispered to himself. Could this artifact have something to do with SCP-032's abilities? Was it more than just a coincidence? He opened the next file, a report from Dr. Hendricks, the researcher who had interacted with SCP-032 before him. The document was heavily redacted, but what remained was enough to send chills down his spine. Subject appears to exhibit abilities beyond initial assessment, Dr. Hendricks had written. Possible reality-bending properties. SCP-032 seems to influence perception, creating a distortion of the observer's reality. Further testing required, but extreme caution advised. Dr. Carter felt his pulse quicken. Reality bending. Had SCP-032 been manipulating his mind, warping his senses? He thought back to the visions, the way the room had shifted and twisted around him. It wasn't just reflection, it was control, an invasion into the deepest recesses of his psyche. He clicked on the last document, a file labeled SCP-032, Project Bridevale. The file was locked, requiring a passcode he didn't have. He frowned, running through possible bypasses in his mind. His clearance was high, but not high enough for this. He needed to see what was inside. His eyes flicked to the corner of his desk where a small mirror lay, a remnant from his old life before the Foundation. He had kept it out of some unconscious habit, but now it felt like a curse. He stared at his reflection, half expecting to see SCP-032's hollow eyes staring back. But there was only his own face, pale and drawn, haunted by sleepless nights and unspoken fears. He couldn't look at it for long. The thought of those eyes, of what might be lurking behind his reflection, was too much to bear. He turned back to the screen and started the encryption bypass, fingers flying across the keyboard. It was risky, bordering on insubordination, but he needed answers. The Foundation's secrets had a way of consuming those who dug too deep, but he was already in too far to turn back. The process took several minutes, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the screen flickered and the file opened, revealing a series of documents, videos, and transcripts. He clicked on the first document, his eyes scanning the text with a mixture of dread and fascination. Project Bridevale. Experimentation with SCP-032 has revealed anomalous properties linked to an unidentified entity. Further analysis suggests SCP-032 acts as a conduit or medium for communication with this entity, which remains unnamed and poorly understood. Dr. Carter's stomach churned. A conduit? Was SCP-032 merely a vessel for something far darker? He clicked on a video file, his heart pounding as the screen changed to show a dimly lit room. In the center of the room was SCP-032, seated and motionless, surrounded by a circle of researchers. They spoke in hushed tones, their words indistinct, as they performed some kind of ritual. The camera shook slightly as it zoomed in on SCP-032's face, and Dr. Carter's breath caught in his throat. Its eyes were closed, but its lips moved, whispering something he couldn't hear. Suddenly, the room darkened, the shadows lengthening and swallowing the light. The researchers' voices grew panicked, their movements frantic as they tried to break the circle. But it was too late. SCP-032's eyes snapped open, and the screen went black, cutting off with a shrill, static-filled scream. Dr. Carter sat back, his mind reeling. What had he just witnessed? A failed containment procedure, a ritual gone wrong? He didn't know, but the implications were horrifying. SCP-032 wasn't just an anomaly. It was a doorway to something else, something that defied understanding. He turned to the last document, a transcript of an interview with SCP-032 following the event. The interviewer was Dr. Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks, what happened during the experiment? What did you do? SCP-032, I did nothing. I merely reflected. Dr. Hendricks, reflected what? SCP-032. The darkness within, the fear. The truth you hide from yourselves. Dr. Hendricks, what truth? SCP-032. That you are all brides waiting for the groom. The union is inevitable. Dr. Carter's blood ran cold. What union? What was SCP-032 talking about? He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. The room suddenly too small, too claustrophobic. He closed the file, leaning back in his chair as he struggled to calm his racing heart. The Bride of Shadows, the mirror effect, the failed experiment, each piece fit into a puzzle that hinted at something much darker than he had imagined. SCP-032 was not just an anomaly to be studied. It was a harbinger, a messenger of an ancient force that lay in wait, biding its time. He stood up, needing to escape the oppressive confines of his office. As he stepped into the hallway, he caught sight of his reflection in the small window on the door. For a split second, he thought he saw someone else looking back at him. A pale, hollow-eyed figure that wasn't him. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by his own haunted visage. He walked away quickly, the shadows in the hallway seeming to stretch toward him as he went. He had come here seeking answers, but all he had found were more questions, each more terrifying than the last. SCP-032 was more than just an entity to be contained. It was a mirror held up to their darkest fears, their most hidden truths. And as he made his way through the cold, silent halls of the Foundation, he couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection was still watching him, following him, waiting for the moment when it would reveal the final, horrifying truth. Dr. Carter paced the confines of his small office, the dim light casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The files he had uncovered played over and over in his mind, a sickening loop of ominous phrases and chilling imagery. He couldn't shake the sense that he was missing something crucial, some piece of the puzzle that would make everything clear. But it was SCP-032's words that haunted him most. The union is inevitable. What union? What was this ritualistic connection it hinted at? The answers seemed just out of reach, tantalizingly close yet maddeningly obscure. A sudden knock at his door made him jump. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached, hesitating for a moment before opening it. To his surprise, SCP-032 stood there, flanked by two silent security personnel. The sight of the entity outside its chamber, standing in the dim hallway like an uninvited guest, sent a wave of cold dread through him. SCP-032, he stammered, struggling to compose himself. What is this? Why are you here? One of the guards stepped forward, his face impassive. SCP-032 has requested a transfer to a different location for an experiment, Dr. Carter. Your presence is required. Dr. Carter's mind raced. An experiment? What kind of experiment would necessitate moving SCP-032? And why involve him specifically? He glanced at SCP-032, its eyes meeting his with an unsettling calm. There was a flicker of something in its gaze, a silent invitation. Or was it a challenge? I don't understand, he began, but SCP-032 interrupted him, its voice as soft and cold as ever. Come with me, Dr. Carter, it said. It is time you saw what lies beyond the mirror. A shiver ran down his spine. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to turn and run in the opposite direction. But he knew, deep down, that he had no choice. The questions that plagued him would only be answered if he confronted the darkness head-on. Very well, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lead the way. The guards escorted them through the winding corridors of the Foundation, the oppressive silence broken only by the echo of their footsteps. SCP-032 walked beside him, its presence a silent shadow that filled him with a sense of impending doom. He could feel its gaze on him, weighing him, measuring him, as if assessing his worth for whatever was to come. They arrived at a room he had never seen before, deep within the facility. The door was unmarked, and as it opened, a cold gust of air rushed out, carrying with it the faint scent of decay and something far older, like the dust of ancient tomes long forgotten. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the walls lined with symbols and sigils that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. At the center was a circle drawn on the floor, intricate patterns woven into its design, spirals and runes that hurt his eyes to look at. Dr. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he took in the scene. This was a ritual chamber, a place designed for purposes far removed from the sterile procedures of the Foundation. SCP-032 stepped into the circle with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. It turned to face him, those hollow eyes reflecting nothing, yet seeing everything. The guards took their places at the edges of the room, silent and watchful. Dr. Carter, SCP-032 said, its voice echoing softly in the confined space. "You seek answers. You seek to understand. This is your chance." He hesitated at the edge of the circle, his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn back. But something compelled him forward, some dark curiosity that had driven him to this point. He stepped into the circle, feeling a rush of cold air wash over him, as if he had crossed a threshold into another world. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What are we doing here?" SCP-032 smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a chill through his soul. "This is a communion, Dr. Carter. A union of reflection and reality. You will see what lies beyond the veil." It extended its hand toward him, a gesture that seemed almost human, yet carried with it the weight of something far more sinister. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to refuse, to run. But his hand moved of its own accord, reaching out, grasping SCP-032's cold, lifeless fingers. The room darkened, the air growing thick and heavy. The symbols on the walls glowed with a sickly light, casting eerie shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. Dr. Carter felt a pressure in his mind, a force pushing against his consciousness, prying at the edges of his sanity. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the sensation, but it was no use. The darkness was inside him, wrapping around his thoughts, pulling him deeper into the void. He felt SCP-032's presence, not just beside him but within him, a cold tendril that wormed its way into the core of his being. "See," it whispered, its voice echoing in his mind. "See what lies beyond." He opened his eyes and the room was gone. He stood in a vast, endless expanse of darkness, the air thick with a sense of ancient power. Shadows moved around him, figures that shifted and swayed at the edges of his vision, their forms indistinct yet filled with a malevolent intent. He felt SCP-032's grip tighten on his hand, and suddenly the shadows parted, revealing a towering figure before him. It was a bride, veiled and shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. It looked at him, through him, and he felt his soul laid bare, every secret, every fear exposed to its gaze. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper, his voice trembling with terror. The figure did not speak, but he heard its voice nonetheless, a chorus of whispers that echoed in the depths of his mind. "I am the Union," it said. "I am the bride and the groom, the beginning and the end. I am the darkness within you, Dr. Carter, the reflection of your deepest fears, your darkest desires." He felt a scream rise in his throat, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its hand a pale, skeletal claw that brushed against his cheek, leaving a trail of ice in its wake. He felt his mind unravel, the fabric of his reality torn asunder by the touch of this being. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. He was back in the ritual chamber, the symbols on the walls dim and lifeless once more. SCP-032 stood before him, its eyes closed, its hand still holding his. He yanked his hand away, stumbling back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What? What was that?" he demanded, his voice shaking with terror and rage. "What did you show me?" SCP-032 opened its eyes, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of something in them, a spark of something almost human. "I showed you the truth," it said softly. The truth of what you are, what you have always been. He shook his head, refusing to believe it. No, it's a lie. It's a trick. SCP-032 smiled sadly. The mirror does not lie, Dr. Carter. It shows you what you refuse to see. He staggered back, the room spinning around him. The guards moved to restrain him, but he pushed them away, his mind a maelstrom of horror and confusion. He had seen something in that void, something that had shaken him to his core. The Union, what did it mean? What was he becoming? As they led him from the chamber, he glanced back at SCP-032. It watched him with those hollow eyes, a silent sentinel of the darkness within. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was not the end. The reflection had been cast, and now it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. He was part of this, bound to SCP-032 in ways he could not yet understand. The ritual had begun, and he was powerless to stop it. The union was inevitable. And as he was led away, the shadows closed in around him, whispering of the darkness that awaited. Dr. Carter sat in his dimly lit office, his hands trembling as he reviewed the footage from the ritual. The cold sweat that clung to his skin was a constant reminder of what he had seen, of the figure that had reached out from the darkness to touch his very soul. He had watched the recording several times, but each viewing only deepened his horror. In the video, he stood within the ritual circle, SCP-032 holding his hand. The room around them seemed to shift, the symbols on the walls flickering with an unnatural light. He watched as his own face twisted in terror, his eyes widening as he stared into the void. Then came the moment that chilled him to the bone, the figure, the bride of shadows manifesting before him, its veil concealing whatever lay beneath. But there was something else, something he hadn't noticed before. As the figure reached for him, SCP-032's expression changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there, a flash of recognition, or was it fear? Dr. Carter rewound the video, watching that moment again and again. Each time, SCP-032's face showed the same fleeting emotion, as if it too was afraid of what it had summoned. He turned off the video, leaning back in his chair, his mind racing. What was the connection between SCP-032 and the entity it had shown him? Was SCP-032 merely a vessel, or was it something more? An accomplice, or perhaps even a prisoner of this darkness? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He tensed, half expecting SCP-032 to be standing there once again. Instead, Dr. Emily Hawkins entered, her expression grave. She had been one of the few to witness the ritual, and he could see the same haunted look in her eyes that he felt in his own. "Michael," she began cautiously, "I've been reviewing the data from the ritual. There's something you need to see." She handed him a tablet, the screen displaying a series of charts and graphs, none of which made immediate sense to him. But then she swiped to a set of images, scans of SCP-032's energy readings during the ritual. Dr. Carter's eyes widened as he took in the spikes and fluctuations. "These readings," he muttered, "they're off the charts. I've never seen anything like it." Dr. Hawkins nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Neither have I. SCP-032's energy signature changed during the ritual. It's as if it was channeling something, drawing power from another source." Dr. Carter's blood ran cold. "You think it was acting as a conduit for the entity?" She hesitated, glancing around the room as if afraid they were being watched. "I don't know, but whatever it wasn't just reflecting. It was interacting, communicating with that thing." He set the tablet down, rubbing his temples. His head ached with the weight of it all, the implications spinning out of control. The entity, the Bride of Shadows, it wasn't just an illusion. It was real, and it had used SCP-032 to reach out, to touch his mind. "Have you spoken to SCP-032 since the ritual?" Dr. Hawkins asked, her voice hushed. Dr. Carter shook his head. No, I'm not sure I can. She frowned. You need to. We need to understand what it was trying to show you, what this union it keeps talking about really means. He knew she was right. He had to face SCP-032 again, had to demand answers. But the thought of stepping back into that room, of looking into those hollow eyes, filled him with a terror he could barely contain. Dr. Hawkins placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. You're not alone in this, Michael. We'll get through it together. He nodded, though her words did little to ease the dread that coiled in his gut. The shadows in the room seemed to close in around him, the whispers of the void still echoing in his mind. He stood, gathering his resolve, and made his way to SCP-032's containment chamber. The walk felt like a journey through a nightmare. The hallways were darker than he remembered, the lights flickering as if struggling to hold back the encroaching darkness. He reached the door, taking a deep breath before entering. Inside, SCP-032 sat as it always did, its eyes closed. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, the silence almost deafening. Dr. Carter approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. SCP-032, he began, his voice wavering. I need answers. I need to know what you showed me. The entity's eyes opened, and he felt that familiar pull, the sense of being drawn into an endless abyss. But this time, there was something different in its gaze, something almost sorrowful. You saw the truth, SCP-032 said softly. The truth of what I am and what you are becoming. Dr. Carter clenched his fists, fighting the urge to look away. What do you mean? What am I becoming? A bride, it whispered. A vessel for the Union. You are being prepared, just as I was. The words struck him like a physical blow. Prepared. For what? To become like you. SCP-032's smile was a thin, ghostly thing, filled with a sadness that chilled him to the core. I am the first, the reflection of what is to come. The Bride of Shadow seeks to unite with the darkness within you, to bring forth a new age. The union is inevitable. Dr. Carter shook his head, his mind reeling. No, that's not true. It can't be true. You feel it, don't you? SCP-032 continued. The darkness growing inside you, the reflection taking shape. You are becoming what you feared most. He staggered back, the room spinning around him. He had felt it, the shadows that followed him, the whispers in the dark. But he had refused to believe, refused to accept that he was becoming part of this. This ritual. You can fight it, he said, more to himself than to SCP-032. I can fight it. SCP-032's gaze softened, a strange tenderness in its hollow eyes. You cannot fight what you are, Dr. Carter. The mirror shows you the truth, and the truth cannot be changed. He turned away, unable to bear the weight of its words. He had come seeking answers, but all he had found was more darkness, more terror. The reflection was not just of SCP-032, but of himself, of the shadows that lurked within his own soul. He stumbled out of the chamber, the door sealing behind him with a final, echoing thud. The hallway stretched before him, a tunnel of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. He walked, each step a struggle against the void that pulled at him, whispered to him. As he reached his office, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. For a moment, it was not his face that stared back, but the Bride of Shadows, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by his own haunted visage. He collapsed into his chair, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. He was becoming something else, something he could not comprehend. The union was inevitable, SCP-032 had said. The reflection was taking shape. And as he sat there, the shadows closing in around him, he knew that this was only the beginning of his descent into darkness. The Bride of Shadows waited, and soon the veil would be lifted and the truth revealed. Dr. Carter's world had become a distorted nightmare. Days bled into nights as he wandered the corridors of the Foundation, each corner shrouded in a darkness that seemed to reach out to him. He could feel it, the Union SCP-032 had spoken of, the growing presence of the Bride of Shadows within him. His reflection was no longer just a face in the mirror. It was a haunting reminder of the transformation taking place in his soul. He avoided mirrors now, avoided anything that might show him the truth. The shadows in the hallways moved of their own accord, whispering secrets only he could hear. He saw things in the corners of his vision, glimpses of figures that vanished when he turned to look. The facility, once a place of cold logic and procedure, had become a labyrinth of horror. It wasn't just him, either. The entire Foundation seemed to be unraveling. Reports of strange occurrences were piling up, lights flickering, objects moving on their own, personnel experiencing vivid nightmares. It was as if SCP-032's influence was spreading, seeping into the very fabric of the facility. Dr. Carter sat at his desk, staring at the files spread out before him. There had to be a way to stop this, to sever the connection before it was too late. He had to believe that, even as the darkness closed in around him. He reached for a document, his hand shaking as he tried to focus on the text. A knock at his door shattered the silence, making him jump. He hesitated before opening it, half expecting to see the shadows themselves standing there. But it was Dr. Hawkins, her face pale and drawn. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days, her eyes hollow with fear. "Michael," she said urgently, "we need to talk. Something's happening with SCP-032. He motioned for her to enter, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" She closed the door behind her, glancing nervously around the room as if afraid they were being watched. "The containment measures are failing. SCP-032 is changing. It's merging with something. We don't know what." A chill ran down his spine. Merging. How is that possible? She shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't know. But the energy readings are off the charts. It's like SCP-032 is becoming something else, something more powerful. The containment unit can't hold it much longer." Dr. Carter felt the floor drop out from under him. The Union. It was happening, right now. He could feel it, the pull of the void, the Bride of Shadows reaching out from the other side. The darkness that had been growing inside him was now manifesting, spreading beyond the confines of SCP-032's chamber. "We need to contain it," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need to." A sudden, ear-splitting alarm cut him off, the lights in his office flickering violently. Dr. Hawkins gasped, grabbing his arm as the room plunged into darkness for a moment before the emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie red glow. The shadows stretched and twisted around them, shapes moving in the crimson haze. "The containment breach alarm," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "SCP-032 is breaking free." Dr. Carter's heart raced as he bolted from his chair, pulling Dr. Hawkins with him into the hallway. The facility was in chaos, sirens blaring, lights flashing. Personnel were running, shouting orders that were lost in the cacophony. And in the midst of it all, he felt the presence of the void, the bride's essence seeping through the cracks of reality. They made their way towards SCP-032's chamber, the air growing colder with each step. He could see his breath misting in front of him, the chill sinking into his bones. The door to the containment unit was wide open. The guards who had stood watch now lying motionless on the floor, their faces contorted in expressions of sheer horror. Dr. Carter approached the chamber cautiously, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside, SCP-032 stood in the center of the room, its eyes open and glowing with an unnatural light. The air around it seemed to pulse and distort, the very fabric of reality warping under its influence. "SCP-032, he called out, his voice shaking. "What are you doing? Stop this." The entity turned to him, and for the first time he saw not the hollow eyes of a lifeless doll, but the gaze of something ancient and malevolent. The Bride of Shadows stared back at him through SCP-032's form, a smile playing on its lips. "It is time," it whispered, its voice a chorus of echoing whispers that filled his mind. "The Union is upon us." Dr. Hawkins stepped forward, her hands trembling. "We have to stop this," she said, her voice edged with panic. "We have to contain it." Dr. Carter knew it was too late. He could feel the pull, the draw of the darkness that had taken root within him. He had been marked from the beginning, chosen as the vessel for this union. And now, SCP-032 was merely the gateway, the conduit for the bride's arrival. There's no stopping it, he murmured, his voice hollow. It's already begun. SCP-032 raised its hand, and the air around them crackled with energy. Dr. Carter felt a forced tug at him, pulling him toward the entity, toward the reflection that had been taking shape within him. The shadows in the room writhed and twisted, coalescing into a swirling vortex that enveloped them. He was lifted off his feet, suspended in the air as the darkness wrapped around him, seeping into his skin, into his very soul. He could hear Dr. Hawkins screaming, but her voice was distant, drowned out by the roar of the void that filled his ears. Embrace the darkness, SCP-032's voice echoed in his mind. Become what you were meant to be. He wanted to fight, to scream, to tear himself away from the consuming blackness, but it was too strong, too all-encompassing. It filled him, changed him, the shadows becoming one with his being. The Bride of Shadows whispered to him, its voice soothing and terrible all at once. You are mine, now and forever. The vortex tightened around him, crushing him, remolding him. His mind fractured, reality slipping away as he was drawn into the abyss. He was no longer Dr. Carter, no longer a mere man. He was the reflection, the union of shadow and light, the bride's chosen vessel. As the world around him dissolved into darkness, he felt a final, fleeting thought drift through his consciousness. A thought of what he had been, of the man who had sought answers and found only horror. And then, there was nothing. Only the void, the eternal shadow that consumed all. Dr. Hawkins stood in the chamber, her eyes wide with terror as the shadows closed in around her. SCP-032, no, the Bride of Shadows, watched her with those glowing eyes, the reflection of its own darkness now manifest. She turned and fled, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty halls of the Foundation. The shadows followed, spreading like a plague, the darkness consuming everything in its path. And in the center of the maelstrom, SCP-032 stood, a silent sentinel of the void, the union complete. The bride had found its groom, and the world would never be the same again. Dr. Carter opened his eyes to darkness. It was a void, vast and infinite, a place where light could not penetrate. He was no longer in the SCP Foundation, no longer in any place that he could recognize. Here, in this shadowy realm, he felt weightless, like a ghost drifting through the remnants of a nightmare. He tried to remember who he was, what had happened, but his thoughts were fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror. The last thing he recalled was the vortex of shadows swallowing him whole, the Bride of Shadows pulling him into the abyss. Now, he floated in this place of endless black, his very essence laid bare and invulnerable. In the distance, a figure began to form, slowly taking shape from the swirling void. It was a woman, her form shrouded in a veil of darkness, her presence commanding and terrible. The Bride of Shadows. Her eyes glowed with an unearthly light, and as she moved closer, he felt an oppressive weight settle over him, crushing him under the gravity of her gaze. You are awake, she whispered, her voice echoing around him, within him. It was not just a sound, but a feeling, a sensation that twisted in his mind. The union is complete. He struggled to speak, to assert his identity in this place that sought to erase him. I am Dr. Michael Carter, he managed, his voice weak and hollow. I am not yours. The bride's smile was a sliver of white in the dark. You are what I made you, she said. What you have always been. The reflection of darkness within you, given form. No, he whispered, shaking his head. He felt the pull of her words, the truth in them, but he fought against it. I am more than this. Are you, she asked, her voice soft and mocking. You sought the truth, and now you see it. You are not separate from the darkness, Dr. Carter. You are a part of it, as it is a part of you. He felt the coldness of the void seep into him, filling him with a despair that seemed boundless. She was right. He had felt it growing within him, the shadow that had mirrored his every fear, every hidden desire. It was not just SCP-032, it was him. He had become the very thing he had sought to understand. Why, he demanded, the question torn from his soul. Why me? Why do this? The bride moved closer, her presence enveloping him. Because you looked into the mirror and did not turn away. You sought the reflection, and in doing so, you opened the door. She reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek. It was cold, like the touch of death itself, and he shuddered at the contact. You are my groom, she whispered. The one who would join with me, who would become the vessel for the new age. He tried to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. The void was endless, and he was trapped within it, ensnared by the shadows that had become a part of him. I am not your groom, he said, his voice breaking. I will not be your vessel. The bride's eyes flashed with a light that was not of this world. "You have no choice," she said, her voice like a knife in the dark. "The union is inevitable. You are already mine." He felt a scream build in his throat, but no sound came out. The darkness pressed in on him, crushing him, suffocating him. He was losing himself, being consumed by the void, by the shadow that was now his soul. But then something stirred within him, a spark of defiance, a glimmer of light in the endless black. He clung to it, to the memory of who he had been, of the man who had fought to understand the unknown. He was Dr. Michael Carter, and he would not be consumed so easily. "No," he said, his voice stronger this time. "I will not become you." The bride recoiled slightly, as if his words had struck her. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment he saw something in them, fear, or perhaps surprise. He didn't know if he could fight her, if he could resist the darkness that threatened to swallow him, but he had to try. He had to hold on to himself, to the light that still flickered within him. He reached out, not to her but to the void itself, to the shadows that surrounded him. They were a part of him, yes, but they did not define him. He was more than the darkness, more than the reflection that had been cast. He felt the shadows twist around him, felt them shift and change under his touch. They were not solid, not real. They were a construct, a manifestation of fear and despair. He could bend them, shape them, make them his own. The bride watched him with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice filled with a venomous fury. "I am taking back what is mine," he said, his voice echoing through the void. "I am not your groom. I am not your reflection." He pulled at the shadows, tearing them away from his soul, casting them aside. They writhed and screamed, but they did not resist. They could not resist. They were his to control, his to banish. The bride let out a shriek, a sound that tore through the void like a blade. She lunged at him, her hands outstretched, her eyes blazing with a terrible light. But he stood his ground, the darkness swirling around him but not within him. "You are nothing without me," she screamed, her voice breaking with fury. "You are nothing." "I am more than you," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. "I am more than the darkness." And with that, he cast her out. The shadows around him exploded into light, the void shattering like glass. The bride's scream echoed through the fractured darkness, a sound of rage and defeat that faded into silence. Dr. Carter fell to his knees, gasping for breath as the void crumbled around him. The darkness was gone, the shadows that had threatened to consume him banished by his will. He was himself again, whole and unbroken. He opened his eyes to find himself back in the SCP Foundation, in the containment chamber of SCP-032. The room was cold and dark, the symbols on the walls now nothing more than faded marks. SCP-032 lay on the floor, its eyes closed, its form lifeless and still. He stood on shaky legs, his body weak, but his mind clear. He had done it. He had fought the darkness and won. The Bride of Shadows was gone, banished back to whatever realm it had come from. He turned to leave, his heart heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The union had been broken, but at what cost? He had seen the darkness within himself, had felt its pull. It was still there, a part of him that he could never fully erase. But he would live with it. He would face it, just as he had faced the bride. He was Dr. Michael Carter, and he would not be defined by the shadows. As he stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered for a moment, a brief flash of darkness that passed as quickly as it had come. He paused, glancing back at the closed door of SCP-032's chamber. The bride was gone, but her shadow remained, a whisper of darkness that lingered in the corners of his mind. And he knew, as he walked away, that the mirror was still there, waiting for the day when he would look into it once more.